So we are in Leviticus, and we're now to our second half. So we're going to spend this week in Leviticus, next week in Numbers, and then we'll spend 2 weeks in Deuteronomy. And as I said, when we get to Deuteronomy, part of what we'll do in that is to actually work through the Ten Commandments. I like holding those until we've been through the rest, and I like to be able to compare because Moses' form of them is slightly different between Deuteronomy and Exodus. And that, as we said, is because he's basically preaching them. He's not just saying, let me read the law to you again, but let me explain and unpack it. So just like a pastor would stand in the pulpit and go, if I could say this another way, I would say it this way to make things clearer. Mostly what he's doing is sort of bringing it up to date with shifts from their being just out of Egypt to their entering the promised land. And then he's dealing with some specific sin issues that they've encountered along the way that he wants to forestall. So we'll do that when we get there. And then we'll think most broadly, because I know this topic's going to come up today, but we'll hold our big discussion of how believers relate to the law for Deuteronomy as well. Because there's some pieces we need out of Deuteronomy to be able to understand that. So we don't have quite all the data we need yet out of Moses' Pentateuch to be able to answer some of those questions. Deuteronomy will help us with that. So those are kind of two things that we certainly have some questions about today, but our primary unpacking of the Ten Commandments and then of believers' relationship to the law will come in our last session in Deuteronomy. That's where we'll spend the majority of our time for our last session together. So we are halfway through, starting our second half today, and we will be in the book of Leviticus today. All right? Let me pray for us, and then we'll dive into the text. Father, thank you for this chance to come together and to study your word, to think about this book, which is challenging for us, feels so distant and far away, and in many ways has been removed from our experiences. We don't perform these rites or these rituals anymore, and yet, as Paul would say, it was written for our instruction. So help us to understand, Father, both the nature of what it means to live as believers, but also the ways in which we might be instructed by this text. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. So as we have done along the way, we need to begin with thinking about where we are in the literature, right? So just as if you were reading The Lord of the Rings and you tried to read the middle or the last book without reading the first two or knowing where they had gone, you can't just dive in. You have to understand where you've been. So as we talked about Genesis, it's primarily founded and driving towards and from the promises to Abraham of giving him a land, a nation, and then making his name great ultimately for the purpose that he and his descendants would be a blessing to the nations. So as we said, as we worked through Genesis, Israel was never designed to be the end, the terminus of God's blessing, but rather to be a conduit for God's blessing. So when we think of things ending with Israel, we've misunderstood the nature of what God is doing. He intended to work through the Israelites who would come from Abraham in order to bless the world. Now, Exodus then focuses not on the land or really on the blessing portion of this, but on their transition to becoming a nation instead of a family. We leave off the patriarchal structure and we don't get another son of Abraham. Instead, we move to Moses and we have Aaron, sort of dual leadership. We begin to see the basic structure that the land is going to be governed in this way, and we pick up the laws of the nation as the covenant is put in place at Sinai. So the question is, what is Leviticus going to be about? How should we understand it? And what I'm going to suggest today is that the scene has not changed. Remember, they're going to be at Sinai. They reach Sinai in chapter 18 of Exodus. They're going to be there all through Leviticus. So from the time they get to Sinai, they stay there for the rest of the book of Exodus. They're there all for the book of Leviticus. And they don't leave until Numbers chapter 10, verse 11, I think it is, right in the middle of the chapter that they leave. So that whole stretch, they're still camped out at the foot of Sinai. Okay, so we're on the other side of the golden calf incident, and now we're unpacking more things after the completion of the tabernacle. So this is where we sit. If you don't go anywhere, we're primarily not doing new things. So I think our focus is still national, but with the golden calf and now the construction of the tabernacle, really what we're looking at is how will this nation survive having a holy God in their midst, right? Because they've demonstrated this is a problem, right? They understood inherently that it was better for Moses to go see God on the mountain because his presence is dangerous as much as it is saving. right? And so if you were to just look at the phrase in their midst and those kind of related phrases, sometimes he's among them to save, and sometimes he is among them to judge. So how will a sinful nation coexist with a holy God literally dwelling in the center of their camp? They are arranged around him, around the tabernacle. So how will they survive? Because the golden calf proved how deadly sin is and how holy he is. So Leviticus is going to focus then on issues of holiness. So both how do you maintain it, but what happens when you are sinful? What are God's remedies for moving out of that sinfulness and back into holiness, back into a state of relationship with him? And then ultimately, how will they worship? That's where all this is headed, right? It's all relational. So when he says, I will be your God and you will be my people, that you will know me, he's talking about a relationship with them. And that then, if we understand him well, as we talked about in the book of Exodus, if we actually get who he is, that should drive us to worship. It's part of how we know that we have a good portrait of who he is if that portrait pushes us to worship. So Leviticus is going to focus on issues of holiness, both what gets you out of that state and back into that state, and then ultimately, what does it look like for them to be worshipers of God? And all this is flowing out of sort of really twofold events: the golden calf and its aftermath, and then the construction of the tabernacle so that the worship services can go fully as they were intended to be. My summary today is not mine. It's from Alan Ross's commentary, Holiness to the Lord. If you are looking to do some work, this is a fairly user-friendly commentary. Ross's commentary on Leviticus is excellent, very good at explaining sort of the connections between parts of Scripture and how that works. So this is his summary. The book of Leviticus contains practical instructions for priests as they lead the corporate and individual worship of Israel at the sanctuary, and as they develop the collective and personal holiness of the nation, so that the Holy Lord God might dwell in peace with them and bless them. Okay? So Leviticus is primarily written for the priesthood. It lays out their rules, their regulations. It goes way beyond what Exodus gives. Exodus really gives us startup instructions. How do we first get Aaron and his sons ready for priesthood? And then they get installed, they're consecrated, they're put in, and we get some rules for them. But Leviticus is going to become their manual. This really is how they're supposed to do their job. Here are all the sacrifices. Here are all the festivals. Here are all the nitty-gritty of these things, so that the priests can then become really the teachers of Israel, so that when people have a question about what they should do, what they should not do, how do they encounter this situation, the priests would be ready to answer those, all for the purpose of helping the people maintain their relationship with God so that they should worship. So one of the things that we need to grab beyond this being instructions for priests is that this is how we typically think of this, is that Israel functions more corporately and collectively than we feel like we do. And I say it that way very particularly. The New Testament talks about us almost exclusively in corporate terms, right? We are part of the body of which we are its many members. So we think of individual because I must express faith in Christ. But my salvation cannot, if I understand it well in New Testament terms, cannot be understood as individual, because as I'm saved, the Spirit does what? The Spirit baptizes me into the body, right? So the difference is Israel starts out in the collective, right? So you are born an Israelite, so you are part of the crowd. And then you must individually choose, will I walk in obedience to the covenant that God has made with us? The difference is on the new covenant end, I am born individually because God has worked in my heart. I've expressed faith and belief in Him. I've confessed that. But then as soon as that happens, I am baptized into the body. So both of them are corporate and collective, but the relationship of the individual to the collective is different. On this one, I step in collectively, and then I must choose what I'm going to do individually. In this one, I'm going to enter individually, but I must operate as part of the collective, right? We are part of the body. You have been gifted. I have been gifted. We must use those gifts for the body. We're called to keep the peace and the unity of the body. We're called to work as the church to do all that we do. So the shift is in the entrance, not in whether or not we are collective. So that means I think there are ways in which Leviticus can help us see some collective things that we think of only as individual, and we should be attentive to that. However, what we oftentimes miss in the Old Testament is that the Old Testament does deal a lot with the individual and the personal. It's not all just about Israel. So Leviticus is going to think about both the nation and going to think about the individual, and we need to make sure that we grab both of those, and both of those are going to operate in two spheres. How does the individual and how does the collective Israel worship their God? That's really what it's about. And the primary inhibitor, the primary need for that worship is both individual and collective holiness. And just like the church, right, Israel was made up of folks like us. So that means it's always a mixed group, right? Because today you're in good standing with God and I am not up to date, right? I have things in my relationship that need to be dealt with. So there's always a mixture of those who are in the collective who are good, their accounts are short, they have confessed their sin, they're moving. There are others who are always needing that. So there is always an impact and a push and a pull in the collective because the collective is of all the individuals. So we must work together, right, on our corporate holiness, which means we then bring our contribution of our holiness and our worship, but we're also going to do that together.
Is this in, excuse me, is this in part because of an honor-shame culture?
So I dislike that approach in that much of what we see in the ancient Near East is not honor shame in the same way we would think of an Asian culture today. So some have done that analysis, but it's pretty different than what we would think of as, say, a traditional Asian honor shame culture today. It's really not how the ancient Near East operates, and I don't think it's so much how Israel operates either. So those can be helpful lenses for analysis, but I would not, at the end of the day, analyze Israel as an honor shame culture. Yeah, I know I have friends who would in the academy, but I don't think it's the most helpful lens.
I was thinking of the we versus me mentality, the tribe versus the individual.
That's true, but it's more organizational than honor bound, right? So if you think about the household is the smallest organizational structure. So law and justice are had in that sphere, right? And then you have clan, family, tribe, up to the nation. This is not unlike the way that the church has been organized in organizational structures and individual congregations. The family, even when you think about the way Paul talks about, say, the nature of the relationship between men and women, is largely right? So if we think about headship well, it's not privilege or power, it's responsibility and duty, right? So if I'm leading well in my family, I bear the weight, the responsibility of leadership, not the privilege of it. That means then that submission comes as a willing entrance into this organizational structure that the Lord has done so that we operate well together, which again is not an honor shame kind of component, but an organizational one in which then how will the body operate well? And so much of what Paul has to say about worship is about the orderliness of worship, right? So how do we do this well together? So I think those components are more of it than honor shame. Because where we have honor and shame, it's primarily about do we bring honor to the Lord or shame to his name, not about us. So here I would think Jeremiah 13 is the best place to see this. Israel was designed to be a name, a praise, and a glory for God. So then their failures reflect on their failure to be the blessing of Genesis 12 to the nations because they bring shame to his name. So that's why I don't like the honor shame thing, because I don't think it operates at this level. I think it operates more at this one. And that's a very helpful lens then to think about it. Yeah, it's a good question. All right. So what we're going to have to do now is we need to think a little bit about a couple of these terms. And I'm just going to pause here and think a little bit about holiness. Most of us typically learn sort of coming up in the church, and we think of holiness as being separated from. It's true, but not quite accurate. More properly, holiness should be thought of as being dedicated to. Okay? So when take a pot, right, or a pan is set aside for temple use, we can emphasize that that means it can't be used outside the temple. But what makes it special is that it has been dedicated to temple use. That then brings a logical entailment that you can't use it for other things. Okay? So a holy marriage, I am dedicated to my wife. That has the logical entailment that I am separated from all other women in that kind of relationship, but the primacy is here. So again, it's not leaving other gods, it's being attached to him, and that requires then that I must be separated from all other gods. Okay? So that's its primary focus. So we should not lose the separation from. But if we use separation as the primary, it's not quite right in how the language works and how this Hebrew term comes about and the way it's used in other languages. But it also gets the cart and the horse backwards. Separation comes from the nature of the dedicated relationship to. This then means part of what it means when God is holy. If you were to look through the law, you read all through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy in the law. The most basic premise for why the law is this way is the Hebrew phrase, Ki ani Adonai, because I am Yahweh. I act like I am. So the law is like me. Okay, so he is dedicated to acting out of his own character. So it's less about him being separated from us. What separates us is our sin. And he constantly crosses that to try and fix that for us by reaching out to us. So his holiness does have moral components to it because he's dedicated to being who he is. That naturally flows out. He is the very definition of what is good and what is moral. He is the king, so he has the authority to make the moral proclamation, to say what is right and what is wrong. So again, we should think of he is dedicated to who he is, meaning I am who I am. Holiness is another way of saying that. That naturally entails separation from sin, so it has a moral component, but the moral component comes from being dedicated to who he is. He always acts faithfully to his own character, to his own person. We then, if we're to be rightly related to him, must also act like his own person and character, right? So we need to be in alignment with him. So the focus of holiness is really about being with him. That means then that when we talk about these things, if we were to look in the other languages around the ancient Near East, they use this term holiness to mean that something is clean, that it's free from impurities. Well, that makes sense. If I'm walking with him, I am free from the impurities of sin, right? If I am, some will use it in terms of being dedicated, and they'll use it as an adjective of the divine, right? So they'll think of gods as being holy because they are definition and standard, they are those things. So it does mean separateness, but it follows from being dedicated to. So to be holy is to be like God, to be dedicated to God, set apart for his use, and to be like him. And God as the Holy One of Israel is God's sovereign. He is their king. That makes him the moral authority. He is the sole object of Israel's devotion. He is the judge of sin, and he is also their redeemer and the only one capable of their redemption. If we were doing Isaiah, I'd spend a lot more time here, but we're in Leviticus, so we just move on. And maybe in another session, we'll do Isaiah together. Now, here's the problem with Leviticus. That does not, for any of you right now, you don't think worship. If you're a good Israelite, that's got worship written all over it. So, part of how I think about this is I'm sitting in a restaurant with my wife and my oldest daughter. She's probably 4 or 5 at the time. She bites a hamburger, and being a good dad, I just go, "Mrrr." And she's like, "Dad, you're being really strange, right?" I'm like, "Well, where did your hamburger come from?" "The nice lady brought it from the kitchen." "Where did the kitchen get it?" "Well, a chef made it, a cook made it," right? "Where did they get the hamburger from?" "Well, it came on one of those little white trays like mom buys in the store." "Where did that come from?" "A cow," right? And then the chain becomes apparent to her. Part of the issue with understanding Leviticus is that we in our contemporary culture are so far removed from food production that when we hear language of butchering or slaughter, we no longer connect that with food, right? We don't think in those terms. And then secondly, we as a culture, if I just ask you, don't think of food as an aspect of worship, but if you were in a covenant-making culture, you would. We do think of food as fellowship. So it's not a bad move to think of the sacrifices as the original potluck, right? Because with the exception of the whole burnt offering, Almost every sacrifice that's brought is shared, at least by the priests. They are fed from it. They don't have a land allotment, so this is how they're fed. There's grain, there's bread, there's oil, there's all sorts of food, and including meat. So they're going to eat and feed their families from this. But secondarily, it's oftentimes then shared with the worshiper and with all who are worshiping, so that this continually represents that meal on the mountain in Exodus. We are in covenant relationship with God. The relationship has been restored through these sacrifices, and now we're going to sit and share a meal together. Just like the one in Exodus, God's not eating, He doesn't need that, but we are eating at His table. This is why we even think about the Lord's table. Remember, the Lord's Supper is a meal that they share together. We don't do it as a meal, right? Little piece of bread, little cup of juice. We don't do it as a meal, but that's what they were doing originally. They're sharing a communal meal that celebrates their relationship together. So food is fellowship, both with one another and with God, right? So that means that I, as a worshiper, need to be in right relationship with Him and with others. That's why Jesus is going to say the two great commandments are the summary of the law and the prophets. And we, as a people gathered to worship, need to be in right relationship with God and with one another. All right? All of that needs to be in place as a part of worship. So we have to understand how we get to this as a sign of worship. So let me bridge a few gaps for us. When we think about law in the ancient Near Eastern context, laws are always about the character of the lawgiver. So this is a law from a king named Ur-Nammu back around the time of Abraham. And the laws of the ancient Near East always begin with saying, look, I'm a really great king. I'm just. God's chose me because I'm wonderful. And I'm going to show you how wonderful I am by creating just laws for our civilization. So they are designed, partly as propaganda, but they're designed to reflect the ideal character of the lawgiver. And in this case, the laws are not promulgated by Moses, they're given by God directly, so that everyone in the ancient Near East would have understood the laws are designed to tell us about the character of the lawgiver. And in this case, it's not a human king, it is a divine king who has given these laws. Now, in the ancient Near East and in the Bible, most of what we have that we call law is not law the way we think of it. Right? We think of pulling a law code off the shelf. We look up a section number. We read very technical language. And then for the most part, if I'm honest, our culture's not seeking truth. Our culture's seeking what's legally defensible. Let's be honest, right? Can I get away with this? Can this be justified? And that's not the way this worked. Most of what's in the ancient Near East is case law. If this happens, then do this. So the same way that in our system, we have many laws that really were never written by a legislative body. But as the courts have extended principles into a whole bunch of situations, we get what we call case law. No specific law addresses this, but we can take the principles from a whole bunch of them and go, here's the right thing to do in this scenario. Most of the law is that way. If this happens, then do this. And what that teaches them is a way of legal thinking. So things like an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is not an instruction for how much punishment to mete out. It's an instruction for how much punishment is lawful. You may not exceed the crime in the punishment. So if an eye is lost, whether it's monetary or physical, the punishment must match that. This is not a death case, right? So things like eyes and hands have more impact economically. So today, right, if I were to simply walk away from something with a limp and my work is not something that requires me to walk, I'm not an athlete, obviously, right? So in those kind of ways, I'm not going to receive as much money as if for me, something caused me to lose my sight because I do make my living reading text, or my ability to speak because I teach for a living. So we would weigh those economically more valuably than we would something else. That's the premise of the law. So you can't commit murder if someone has physically harmed you and, say, broke a tooth. The punishment has to be proportional. So these are giving guidance in, because remember, as we talked about it being collective, most of the justice is going to happen at the family level, with a father then doing justice for the family, with an upstanding citizen. So Job talks about, right, that he pleaded the case of the widow and the orphan. Why? He's an established person in the community. So they weigh in. They don't really have lawyers in our system, but the elders and those of standing would have both represented and in some cases prosecuted the cases. And so you would come before them for adjudication. Okay? So in all these ways, the law then gives us a set of legal reasoning so that when you go out and then have to do justice everywhere that you live, you have a way of thinking about scenarios that you can then extend. That's their primary orientation. And they do reflect a common law. So, for instance, one of the best ways to see this is there's what's known in the ancient Near East as the law of the goring ox. All right, so if you want to think about living back in Old West days, it's a problem when you mix cattle and people because they have horns, and inevitably somebody's going to get skewered along the way. So there are a million ways that this can play out, right? So you had an ox and it gored someone and now it gores them again. That's a different scenario than if you have an ox, it's never gored anyone and it does it. So with you, we're going to have to ask, what did you do to contain and constrain that animal? Because you have a higher duty now. It's like having a dog that bites, right? You're going to have to be more cautious with that animal than if you have a dog that has never bitten. And if you have one that's killed someone versus injured someone, right? So you have all these. When you look across the Bible and the ancient Near East, you actually need all of them together to collect all the scenarios that would potentially happen for someone being gored by an ox. You actually need, so it's just like with us, we have a whole bunch of laws that no one ever wrote, but they exist as common law. If you're in Louisiana and a couple other places, you get French common law. If you're in most of the rest of the US, you get British common law. Everybody knows it's wrong to murder, it's wrong to steal. We don't actually have to write a whole lot about that. Most of our laws are then about what kind of theft and what kind of killing leads to what kind of punishment and what kind of justice is going to take place. Not the raw fact that it's right or wrong. That just comes to us in common law. Everybody knows that. So the same thing happens here. So they are engaging, just like we do, with some cultural pieces, as well as they're engaging with new revelation from God. Now, in Israel, we have to remember that the law comes from them, not from a king, but it comes as a package with the treaty that they made, the covenant that they made with Yahweh. So, in order to be rightly related to Him, He has redeemed them and they're going to be His people. He's given them the law as a set of household rules. This is how my house will operate. And if you're going to be my people and I'm going to be your God, these are the rules of our house. As we talked about before, they include age and stage kind of changes because the laws will include what to do before they're in the land, after they're in the land, before God develops the temple, after God has the temple built, before there's a king, and after there's a king. All of that is laid out in the law with different things. So sometimes people read the laws and think they're contradictions. Most of the time what they've missed is that it's an age and stage. It's one law before the temple is built about where sacrifices can be done. It is a different law after the temple is built because we're going to consolidate sacrifice into this one place. But they're going to live for a long time before that happens. So the law accommodates both. They have a law for a king, but they don't have a king until we get to Saul. So they're around for a long time without that. So the law here is more of a national constitution, and its focus is on communion with God. So its focus is on how do we have a right relationship with God. If we're going to be His people, this is how we live with Him. And then ultimately the law is pedagogical because it is going to teach us about who God is so that even now for us, and I'm going to see this conversation on the other side of the law, where we're no longer called to follow this law in the same way the Israelites did, it is still designed to instruct us. So this is why Paul's going to say in places like Romans 15, all of this was written for our instruction. It was designed to teach us. So it is both, we could put it this way, it is regulatory, here's your rules, but it is also revelatory because it is a reflection of who He is. And we need to make sure we get both of those in order to understand it well. So it's regulatory how to live and revelatory why and for whom we live. And if we miss that combination, then we miss much of what the law is intended to teach us. Okay? So that's the law side. Now we need to deal with the sacrifice side. I'm going to guess that none of you have seen this before. This is a clay model of a sheep's liver. And in the little squares there are little bits of cuneiform writing, so writing from the Assyrians and the Babylonians. This model was used to train diviners in schools in the ancient Near East to do divination, that thing that's condemned in the scriptures. They would go to school, much like our students come to seminary to learn, they would go. And what they had were huge books, not books, but tablets that they would consult that had all sorts of things. So they believed that when they did a sacrifice, part of what was happening in this sacrifice was that they could magically manipulate the deities. Because when the gods created things like sheep, they couldn't help but accidentally spill some aspects of what they're going to do in the future into that creation. So if you have a good diviner, you take the liver, all those little markings on it match up to a text that says, if there's an abnormality here and it looks like this, that means basically good or bad is usually what you're going to get. And they would do this with everything. They do it with a calf being born, and if its hoof is misshapen and it looks like the head of a lion, usually that means good things. Lions are powerful, right? So it's good for the king. Something else, and it might be negative. And so it was used as a means of getting in the way of blessing or out of the way of curse in kind of an idea that the gods couldn't help that, right? So think the way the Greek and Roman mythologies work. That's very similar to the way the rest of the ancient Near Eastern does. Now, these things were also used as they thought of it, and this is one of the core differences between Israel and the rest of the ancient Near East. Everything that came through divination was primarily for the king, and it was secret. In our language today, it was classified. There were actually laws against disclosing it. Because one of the primary things that's going to happen is a ruler is going to say, should I go to war? Should I make a treaty? I need to know what I'm supposed to do. So this becomes like literally like our sort of intel for what we should do. They're asking the gods what they should do, so there were laws against disclosing it. Israel's revelation was always intended to be made public. It is for the king, and the king has to be obedient to it, but it is always for all of Israel. They are always to learn from this. So there's a core difference in the way that this revelation works and who it's primarily intended for. Now, they did think that by doing the sacrifices, following the God's wills, that they were maintaining social and judicial order. They kind of saw this the primary binary for them is chaos versus order. And so they view the world very differently. Even in terms of creation, if you read the ancient Near Eastern creation stories, it's always a scene of chaos that some God comes in and then defeats something, and then out of that slain entity creates the world. Genesis 1 just says, He made the heavens and the earth. Everything He does is not a fight, it's not a conflict. He simply speaks, and it happens. Radically different. So for them, they are thinking about the maintenance of social order, chaos, and order in the universe. And then significantly, they also viewed it as their way of feeding the gods. So remember when we talked about in Genesis, the gods in the ancient Near Eastern system have needs. They must be fed. They had created lower gods to feed them. When those gods revolt, they create humanity to feed them, but they are needy creatures. And they are creatures. They all have a lineage. They have a mother and a father. They all come from somewhere. This is not the case for the God of the Old Testament. He says, I am. I have no predecessor. I have no backstory. I simply exist, right? Time is inside me. I'm not inside time. I created time. Okay? And then when it comes to his needs, he was like, look, I don't get hungry, but even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. Why on earth would I come to you to be fed? I would take care of myself. I don't need to, but that's how I would do it. There's not a why. You can offer me nothing because everything you have, I gave you. So that would be kind of senseless, right? So all of this is radically different. They would come in every morning. They would bathe the idol. They changed the clothes on the idol, and they would set the sacrifices on the schedule of meals every day in front of the idols. They would take them on holiday, right? They'd put them in a barge, carry them around the canals of the ancient Near East. They'd go to another temple to visit a different deity. Then they'd go together. There were some major festivals that they would go to that would be in the capital, and they would all kind of arrive together and do that. Totally different than the way the scriptures portray God. Okay? So let's think about this sacrifice on Israel's side. It is similar in form. So if we looked at the rest of the ancient Near East, they have a gift offering, a free will offering. Whole burnt offerings are found amongst the Canaanites. They know this form. This looks and feels exactly like the way we thought about circumcision. Abraham doesn't need to be told what circumcision is, but the act is given a different meaning because it's placed in the context of his covenant relationship with God. So, same thing here. Many of these sacrifices are known, they're not totally new, but they are placed in a different setting by being in their relationship with God. They are largely thought of in two ways. One, they're focused as gifts in which they focus on thankfulness. So they're framed in terms of who God is and what He has done. And even offerings to deal with sin are still thought of as gifts because God has been gracious enough to give a means by which our sin might be repaired, right? So even that is an attitude of gratefulness that instead of walking up to the mountain to be destroyed, I can walk to the tabernacle or the temple to be restored, right? This is what the sacrifice does for us. So it is always to be done with a thankful heart. And it is always oriented towards communion. As opposed to on the ancient Near Eastern side, it's really oriented towards manipulation. How do I get what I want out of these deities? And here it is about how do I commune with Him? And He sets the agenda, the rules, the access, and everything about our relationship comes from Him. So that means then that they are focused on expiation and propitiation, two sort of strong legal terms here that have to do with the nature of expiation deals with the legal debt, right? You have a penalty that's owed, and propitiation deals with the relational debt, right? So you do something bad, you may end up restoring someone materially. I've dealt with right? I've made it whole. That may or may not restore the relational component. The sacrifices are focused on both, right? And the law is focused, right? You're going to do restoration. I'm going to return what I stole. I'm going to give more than what I stole, right? There's going to be restitution here, but there also needs the resolution of the wrath. And so both of those pieces are going to be taken care of through the sacrifices as they work here. Now, one of the most challenging parts of dealing with the law is the clean and unclean, okay? This is what everybody always asks me. So you know certain things when you're Old Testament guy, you get asked certain questions. I know the New Testament folks get the same thing. This is always on my top 10 list of things that I get asked is clean and unclean. So a caveat, the model I'm getting ready to give you is a general one. And it will not deal with every single issue, right? You're going to be able to bring me one and go, how does this work? And I'm going to go, I don't know, right? Now I will tell you, if you're working with someone who's teaching and they never say, I don't know, or I've never heard that question before, I would suggest listening to them less. Right? Okay. And I'll even put it this way. Sometimes my students have the inappropriate perception that when they're done with school, they should be able to understand everything on their own. And that actually violates the Lord's own instruction that He gave teachers to the church. I need the rest of the body, which means I need other teachers. Right? I'm not the teacher for the body. I am a teacher for the body. And if I think that somehow I progressed beyond needing other teachers, then I just left the body. So we are never solo in this. Are we called to be approved workers with the text? Yes. It means I have to learn to handle it well, but that never includes the idea that I handle it independently. I will always need the rest of what God has provided, which includes teachers. Right? So some folks asked me this morning a New Testament question, and I was like, I don't know. Right? I have a colleague who knows right off the bat. I could go learn that, but it's not something I know right off the top of my head because that's not what I do. Right? So I need teachers as well. Okay, so that's part of what's happening here as we think about this. Okay, so with those caveats in mind, there is an association of clean with healthiness and wholeness, right? So on the one end of the spectrum, as we think about clean, we can think things about health and wholeness. Something is good, right? It's fit for use. There's an association of unclean at the far end of the spectrum with sin and also with a curse. And I'll give examples of this in a minute. Okay? So part of what we have to wrap our minds around is not everything that is clean is holy. It may just be whole or healthy. Not everything that is unclean is sinful. It may simply be more closely associated with a curse. I'll unpack this with a couple of examples. So we should not automatically equate clean with holy and unclean with unholy or sinful. But on the spectrum, the most clean things are holy, the most unclean things are sinful, but there's a spectrum in between. This is where some of the most significant issues get raised in the Old Testament. So let's start with this one. I usually order death first, but I'll do childbirth first since I have a room full of women. I raised 2 daughters, so I think regularly about raising daughters and reading the Old Testament because many women feel somewhat distanced from the Old Testament, usually because they assume that women are treated negatively in the Old Testament. I'm going to take 2 minutes and do this as an aside, right? So typically when I have these conversations, when I had them with my daughters, raising them, it's things like, well, why are all the Proverbs about the adulteress, right? The woman that you want to avoid. Like, well, that's fine, that's fair. But if you want to grab hold of the adulteress, you also have to grab Lady Wisdom. You don't get to say, I'm being associated with sin and not say, I'm being associated with wisdom. Because the Proverbs do both. What the Proverbs present in short form is a test for the guy. If you've actually heard the instructions of your parents, you don't want her, you want her. So that does mean that women are placed with a don't be her, be her. But not to bear the weight of that, that's the same question the guy's faced. His test just looks different. It would have been different had Proverbs been written for a princess instead of a prince. Proverbs 30 would have been husband instead of a wife. So Proverbs 30 is not designed to tell you a list of what you should do. It's not a checklist to say I'm the ultimate woman. It's a test to say, my son, do you actually understand what we've tried to teach you? This is what should excite you. A noble woman who works hard and ultimately who is godly. If you've understood everything we've tried to teach you, that's the woman you want to pursue, not cheap and easy. Okay? So if you want to hold on to the temptress, you got to loosen that up and grab Lady Wisdom, right? For every time that Israel is presented as an adulterous woman, she's also presented as the bride that the Lord pursued and is going to bring home. They're balanced presentations, primarily oriented towards the men to teach them about that. And then let's go with this one, right? Even in all the same places where Paul's going to talk about submission, what am I? In those same texts, typically within 5 verses. I'm the bride because we are the bride of Christ. If I think women are presented negatively, I can't be part of the bride waiting for the bridegroom to return. But I am, and it's a beautiful place. So let's deal with childbirth. Right? Most women know that in the childbirth laws, the woman is unclean longer when she has a female child than when she has a male child. Most people walk away from that going, see, women are valued less. No. right? We had 3 basic curses that fell out of Genesis 3. To the man, his work would be frustrated. The earth would no longer produce for him in the same way. So his work was going to become toil. For the woman, there would be an increased pain and danger in childbirth. So the act of giving birth to a child is unclean because it's closely associated to that old curse. So the hazard that you're in, the pain that you go through, that exists because of the sin in the garden. But now the difference then, you're giving birth to someone who also, if she has a child, will experience that same thing, right? So there's a multiplication here of association with a curse. I know, right? So the increase in time here is not because women are more unclean, but because this is getting closer and closer to things that relate to the curse. Do you know what the most unclean thing is in the Old Testament? I am. Death. A dead body is the most unclean thing. Why? Because death comes directly from the fall. We are going to return to dust, we decay, and we die because of Adam and Eve's sin in the garden. So many things that are unclean have a sort of limited spread, right? So go read Haggai chapter 2, verses 10 through 19. Haggai asks the priest for a ruling. He's trying to teach them an object lesson. He says, look, so you're carrying holy meat, meaning meat from the sacrifices in your apron, sort of in a chef's apron here. And if you bump into something, does that something become holy? So you knock into a table, bread, whatever, does the holiness spread? And the answer is no. That's right, that's good. It says, now you've touched a dead body and you touch other things. Does the holiness spread? And the answer is yes. Almost infinitely. There's no end in the law to how far that contamination spreads because death is the ultimate representative of the curse. Right? So this is what I mean. There's a relationship between sin and the curse with everything that's unclean in this system. Okay? But it doesn't mean that it's all directly sinful. So someone dying is a result of sin, is a result of the curse broadly, but not necessarily of their sin in this moment, right? So that's not the way that this works. But because this so reminds us of what's wrong with humanity, then this is where we have the highest level of unclean. Okay, so that comes here. Now, where the system falls apart is there's some things I cannot answer for you. Shrimp and pork. I'm very glad, right, that I live in this era because I love barbecue and I like bacon with my breakfast, okay? So what do we do with it? I don't know. Most of the answers that I've heard that have been proffered that has to do with health, yeah, not so much. It just doesn't, there are lots of things in the ancient Near East that would have been equally unhealthy for them, right? All those sorts of things, but there are no other sort of health warnings in that way around what meat's on, what meat's off. Some of them might be things that are predatory or things especially that prey on dead things might flow out of this end with death's association here. So critters that eat carrion are off limits. That might be, that's plausible. But some of them like shellfish, not a clue. There are lots of theories around, but I don't think we know. I think some of what God did in the law, especially with things like that, was simply to say, I want you to be recognizable as my people. So there's certain things I'm going to tell you that are at a moral sense arbitrary. Here's what I mean. Not sowing a field with 2 different kinds of seed. Is there anything morally wrong with that? Actually, no. But it's a lovely symbol of my people being single-minded and single-hearted. Blue tassels. Why not red? Why not gold? Who knows? But it has a symbolic meaning, right? So there's some things which appear to be at a moral level arbitrary, but I will live with them because I want people to know that I'm related to this God and whatever he said, I'm going to follow, right? And so in these ways, some of these things are simply, here's how you're going to be marked, right? And so you're going to live this way so that everybody can go, you're an Israelite. You follow that God named Yahweh. I'd love to know what that's like. Let's chat about that. Other things are deeply symbolic of sin and health then becomes a symbol of salvation, because ultimately what we're doing is defeating death and bringing life. Okay? So, can't handle them all, but we do have some sense here in which we can think about them. So, keys for us. And we'll do more of this when we get to the end. But for us, the ritual is removed, but the revelation remains. So we are not called to attend to the ritual of kosher and keep that, but I am still called to be instructed in a couple of ways. One is I need to think about how regularly my life is sort of trampled over by aspects of the curse. The toil of work, the decay of my body, the death of a loved one. These all exist because sin entered the world and we sit under the curse. We're waiting for Christ to redeem fully, right? The earth groans waiting for its final redemption. Gifts of health and wholeness, right, are pictures of the beauty of salvation and the gift of life. So we still take those. And even the sense in which I should be marked by what I do and how I see, that's an important thing for us, right? Most of their things, they're not a mirror culture. So when they're told to adopt things to their appearance, it is for the sake of others. Handful of them are for them, right? Something around the wrist, I see that when it comes out, just like I see a wedding ring, okay? There are some things, but even those exist for other people, right? This is a beautiful symbol to say, this one is in relationship. Yeah. Yeah. So in these ways, they serve, but they primarily serve for others. So whether it's the field, whether it's the garments, whether it's the haircut, all those kinds of things, they're oriented to say, here's who I am. It's like wearing a logo, right? I belong to this entity. And so it's a kind of branding to say, I belong to this community. So we need to think about those things. And then we need to think about the relationship between holiness and ritual. Leviticus 28 will tell us, I'll just read this text for us. Keep my statutes and do them. I am Yahweh who sanctifies you. Do the ritual, but you need to understand the ritual doesn't sanctify you. I do. Doing the ritual is an expression of faith in the one who actually does the work, right? So baptism doesn't save me, but Christ said, go and baptize them. So if I want to be obedient to Christ, I get baptized because that's what he tells me to do. But I understand that the baptism doesn't save me. It's God who saves me, right? So in those ways, the ritual is clear that it's not mechanical and it's not magical. I can't do it and force God's hand. This is why Isaiah 1, I hate your feast, your new moons, your Sabbaths. Well, all of those are things he commanded. So they're not bad, but I hate the way you do them because you don't do them with me in mind. You're trying to manipulate me. And so in these ways, then what we're looking for is we're looking for the cheap and easy. I gave you flowers, you have to forgive me. Yeah, it doesn't quite, right? It doesn't quite work that way. So holiness and ritual are related, but they're related in the same way that we get in the New Testament. If we confess our sin, that's a ritual. He is faithful and just to forgive us. He does the forgiveness. I don't wrest it from him through my actions. He graciously provides it, but he's given me a means for coming to him. And so I take advantage of those means in faith, and then he does the work. Same thing happening in the Old Testament. All right? So now we will work our way. I'm just going to do a quick overview, and then we'll take questions. I want to walk through the sacrifices. I want to walk through the feast, and I'm going to go fairly fast with these. And then I want to just take a look at the Day of Atonement, and we'll do questions. All right? So the burnt offering here is The only one that is not eaten by the sacrificer or by the priest. This is the one that primarily deals with sin. There are others that go with it, but this is the one that sort of is the biggie that then allows the others to take place. So it tends to be the entrance is through the burnt offering. The cereal offering is also called the grain offering, and the very term itself means gift. So it is an expression of thanks and devotion, and it follows the acceptance of the burnt offering. So think about the logic of this. I need to deal with my sin. Sin requires a life, so here's the life given. The very next thing I do is to offer a thank offering, a gift offering. I am grateful that you have made means for our relationship to be restored. Okay? And so the order, there's a logic to them of how they flow. Then what do? Well, we celebrate that there's peace in the relationship. We celebrate that He is about reconciling us. So we move from dealing with sin, thankfulness for that, and then the celebration of peace. Now, for other particular needs, we might need a purification offering. This can be for sin, it can be for uncleanness. It's going to move in a variety of ways, but it is sort of the picture of this is, yes, my relationship has been restored, but I still need to be cleaned. This is a little like Jesus' conversation with Peter, right? Okay, if you're clean, you don't need a bath. That's the burnt offering. You've been cleansed, but you may still need to have your feet washed. You've still got some muck on you from living life, okay? So you still need that. That's the purification offering. You still have things that need to be dealt with along the way in terms of cleansing. There's the reparation offering that deals with making things right. So whether it's something I've taken from God, something I've taken from you, the reparation offering is about restoring that. So it will include aspects of restitution, like literally giving monetary funds or replacing something. It's going to have those kinds of aspects to it as well. I told you this was a fast overview. If you were in my class, I make my class say, I'm like, my class is supposed to respond with the phrase, survey, right? We fly high and fast. So, and we're flying higher and faster here than we even do in class. All right? So Sabbath, it is rest, but it symbolizes spiritual rest. We'll talk about it when we get to Deuteronomy. We start with a rationale, a motive for it being creation. Just like God rested from His work in creation, we're supposed to rest. When we get to Deuteronomy, you've been pulled out of slavery, and rest represents a kind of salvation. Hebrews is going to pick this up and think about entering into the land and entering in rest as pictures of salvation. Not going to do anything with unleavened bread. In the footnotes there, I've given you a link to an article that I wrote for TGC that goes through the law of the unleavened bread. So grab that, go read it. It's short. It'll teach about that. Passover is about that deliverance and redemption. And remember that when we talked about it, both things are happening. They're being delivered, they're being taken out of slavery, but they're being purchased. So when the angel comes, right, they're literally being delivered from death to life, because if they're not covered with the sacrifice, they're going to die. But the means by which they got there is the life that's given in the sacrifice. So it is a picture of both. You're being taken from life to death. There's not a third category to live in. And the way that you get there is by redemption through life that's given. So this becomes then a picture of Christ as the Passover writ large, because we need to be moved from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light. And that only happens through a life being given. And He is the life that is given for us. Pentecost in the Old Testament is a celebration of the harvest and the giving of the law. They'll combine those two together. And so that makes a natural place for thinking about the giving of the Spirit, right? We even talk about what the Spirit does for us is to give us His fruit and to bear that in us. So there's a relationship between this idea of growth, right? So the vine and the branches, well, how does that happen? Well, it happens through the work of the Spirit who connects us to Christ, baptizes us into the body, who indwells us, and then who bears His fruit in us. Trumpets is all about ingathering. So it's going to be used in the New Testament to think about the future gathering of the Lord's saints. And then now we come to, we're going to hold the Day of Atonement because we're going to spend our last bit there. And then we have the Tabernacles or Feast of Booths, Sukkot as it is called. This is where if you've ever had a Jewish neighbor, they'll build a little kind of a hut sort of a structure. You can see them all over. And it celebrates the summer fruit harvest. That's temporally when it comes. It celebrates the wilderness provision because that's the idea of the booths. We used to live in temporary structures as we wandered the wilderness, and God provided for us. But it also comes to symbolize promises kept. In part, that's the giving of the law and others. And so it is the single most important, even more than Passover, becomes the most important one in the post-exilic period after they come home. So if you read Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, there's more kind of done with the Feast of Booths than there is even with Passover. It's kind of a transitional piece that takes place. So we need to talk about atonement. Atonement, the word in Hebrew is kippur or kapporet, depending on whether they're talking about the verb or the noun. And basically, it's got a couple of different meanings. One is to cover. So when Noah covers the ark in pitch, that's this word. He kippurs it. He paints it with pitch to waterproof it, which makes an interesting kind of an idea of cleansing, right? You can cover over. I think of it as something like putting kills on before you paint a room that, if you've got a little bit of mold or something, right? You put something over it so that it can't break back out. That's sort of the image that we get. It also, in some other languages, can mean to wipe clean, the same way you would take a plate and wipe it clean to make it fit for use again. It can have those meanings. The mercy seat, right, as we call it, is the place of dealing with sin. And here it's not a covering, but it's the cleansing the temple of sin and dealing with the effects of that. Romans 3:25 will tell us that Christ replaces the mercy seat, and he is the place where atonement happens. But the single easiest place to see what is meant by atonement in the majority case is Genesis 32:20. When Jacob is about to meet Esau, right? And he's sending gifts and people ahead, hoping that he and his family don't die because of how horribly he treated Esau. He says this, tells his servants, "You shall say, moreover, your servant Jacob is behind us. For he thought, I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterward I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me." This appeasing the face is maybe I can compare. Maybe I can deal with the relational wrath such that he will accept me. Right? There's a subtle difference in the way that we talk about things that's really important. I'm going to say this and then I'll unpack it. Ultimately, what we are saved from is not hell. What we're saved from is the wrath of God. I am saved by God from God. It's not a third party. It's not something outside of him. What I'm saved from is his just action of giving me the penalty that's due for my sin. So what is needed in this sacrifice is to appease that wrath and then to settle the legal debt. That's those two terms, propitiation and expiation. Relational wrath, Genesis 32, and legal debt. Right? Colossians, that legal debt was nailed to the cross. This is what's happening in that. So as we think about this, that's what we're looking at. Now, what we need to unpack is that's kind of the concept behind it. But we need to unpack the ritual itself. It involved two goats, right? The one goat is for the Lord. The other one is what we refer to as the scapegoat. That's literally where we get the term from, is an old translation for this goat. There's a dilemma here, and there's a picture, okay? So the one goat is sacrificed, whole burnt offering, and it represents the satisfaction of God's wrath. The other one represents the sin being removed. So they confess on both animals, but the one gets wholly offered. The other one they confess, and then they send it out of camp. What do you think that little goat does? Really? I'm thinking it comes back. Yeah. It's a herd animal, right? Part of the accusation against Israel in Isaiah 1 is a donkey knows where it gets fed, But my people are so clueless. You have no idea where your food is. My dog shows up every day to the minute when it's time to feed her, right? She's not wearing a watch, but she knows when and where she gets fed to the second, right? She pops up and you turn around, she's just staring at you. Animals know. A herd animal is going to return home. So there's an old tradition. I don't think these are true, but there are two old Jewish traditions. One is that they would take the goat out and stake it so that it would die. And the other one is they push it off a cliff, right? Because think about the picture of this. Part of what's happening in this is we're being taught visually that this is not the permanent fix. How would you feel if that little goat representing your sin always comes back to camp? I think that's why we have these traditions developed of we need it to go out and die because I need sin to be dealt with. But that little critter comes back home, and then we do the Day of Atonement every year. It's never done. It just keeps happening over and over. It's a built-in way of saying this is not the permanent fix. You need more than this. Okay? So, land, nation, and blessing, about the nation, and now we've hit worship and holiness. Let me bridge a little bit of the gap for us here. 1 Peter, I think, is the best place to do this. In 1 Peter 1, 13 through 21, ties together our holiness and the Lamb who sacrificed for us. Right? And if you want to look at holiness in 1 Peter, it's in 1:15, 2:5, 2:9, and 3:5. So Peter begins by talking about us as the body and our relationship to Christ and our holiness. So 1:13, therefore, preparing your mind for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who has called you is holy, you also be holy in your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy as I am holy. Notice down in verse 19, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot, that's language of a suitable atonement lamb, he was foreknown before the foundation of the world, was made manifest in the last times for the sake of you, who through him are believers in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. Right? Peter's adopting the language of the Old Testament and saying the same thing's still in place. This is about our connection to God, our communion with him, and our worship. And that means we need to be holy. But the mechanism of holiness is not through the lamb slain every year over year, but through the lamb that was slain once and for all. Okay? So he is tying these pieces together for us. And then in 2:4 to 10, he tells us that we are a royal priesthood who are supposed to offer spiritual sacrifices. The royal priesthood language begins in Exodus and carries on through the Old Testament. It's one of the primary ways of talking about what Israel was supposed to be. Not just the Levites, but they as a nation were supposed to be priests, intermediaries between God and the nations. That's part of their conduit, is to be teachers of who God is so that other people could come and be rightly related to him through the revelation that he had given. Now, what's key here is these two places. Malachi 2, I'll read this for us, 6 and 7. Because I think on the whole, we tend to not think of priest well. We think of priest as only being about doing the sacrifices. But Malachi 2, 6 and 7, talking about his covenant with Levi, the priest. My covenant with him was one of life and peace, and I gave them to him. It was a covenant of fear. He feared me. He stood in awe of my name. True instruction was in his mouth, and no wrong was found on his lips. He walked with me in peace and uprightness. He turned many from iniquity. For the lips of the priest should guard knowledge, and people should seek instruction from his mouth, for he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts. That phrase, messenger of the Lord, is the same phrase as the angel of the Lord. So there's one who shows up to represent God. That's the priest. The priest is all of Israel, and the priest is all of the body. We tend to think of the prophets as the teachers And the priest is no longer needed because they do the mechanical stuff of ritual. Actually, the priests were designed to teach. It's interesting to me that we're not primarily cast as prophets in the New Testament. We're cast as priests because we take what we have been given and we teach that to the world, that we can proclaim the excellencies of Christ. And then Ezra 7:10 says that the good hand of God was on Ezra because he had set his heart to study the law, to do it, and to teach its precepts in Israel. Study, do, and teach. We as priests must do all three of those. We cannot omit one, and we cannot reorder them. What if you're doing, but you've never studied? We call those morons, right? You're just making it up. If you teach, but you don't do, you're a hypocrite. You teach and you haven't studied, we call those heretics. You cannot leave any of them out. And you cannot reorder them. If I do before I know, I'm just making it up. I teach before I obey, right? All and in that order are required, and that is the role of a priest, which is our role, according to Peter. This is how true instruction is found. I set my heart to learn it for myself. I set my heart to do it, to follow what I learn, and then I offer it. And we are all teachers, let's be clear, right? Right? Go make disciples, teaching them to obey. That's not limited to pastors. It's not limited to profs. That is the call of every disciple to make more disciples by teaching them. You teach children, you teach one another, you teach your spouse, you teach everyone that you engage with by your life and by your words. We all inherently teach. That's the call of the priest. To guard knowledge, turn people from iniquity, and to teach them the excellencies of Christ. That's what we're called to do. All right? Questions? What do you have? Yeah. Yeah. What else? All right, then I'm going to leave you with some discussion. Here are three things that I think are worth discussion today. How might Leviticus help you see both individual and corporate aspects of holiness? We tend to think individually, but we even in the body need to think more corporately. How might Leviticus help you see both individual and corporate aspects of worship? Again, we tend to think, interestingly here, corporate because worship is something I do when I go, and we need to think more individually. Those kind of split. And then here's probably the best place. What are the next steps for your priestly ministry? Do you think learn, do, and teach? Those three and in those order. Where are the places that you need to take the next steps in terms of being a priest who has true instruction and being one who proclaims the excellencies of Christ, as Peter will say? That's the next step. All right. Let me pray for us, and then I'll leave you all to chat. Father, we are grateful that you would bring your word to us through those who wrote it, that you would bring your Spirit to us, that he might enable us to understand it. And so, Father, we pray that we would come to learn your word, that we would love to do it, and that you would give us opportunity and boldness to teach it. So we ask all these things in your Son's name. Amen. Thank you all. I'll see you next week.